Okay, week 10, read 436. This week we're going to be looking at the sociocultural lens and thinking about literacy development. We've been looking at the cognitive lens for the last 2 weeks. Now we're going to sort of switch gears and look at a not necessarily opposing perspective, but a perspective that builds on and offers some um, alternative perspectives on the ways in which and the influences on adult students' literacy development. So I want to start with a sort of a really basic frame for understanding these two lenses that we've looked at that can help guide us. So we've been looking at the cognitive lens the last 2 weeks, and one of the things that we've talked about here is this idea about the brain as this sort of computer processor, right? Really, it focuses on the individual and the things that happened inside of our brain. So if you look at the right side of that arrow here, you can see that in the cognitive process, the cognitive perspective, what understanding starts internally inside the individual brain, and then as it's developed, it is conveyed, it is externalized to the world. The sociocultural perspective is the opposite, and that is what we come to understand, what we then come to internalize, actually starts in our interactions in the external world. That is, in situations in our home, our school, etc., we get ideas, messages are transmitted to us, and from there we start to actually construct meanings and perspectives and viewpoints from those external experiences. So, thinking about those two perspectives, I want to sort of take a rehash on two concepts that came up last week, because I asked you in your group task to take on the stanzas of Hirsch and Moll and talking about what knowledge matters and where that knowledge comes from. So you might have noticed in the core knowledge document that Hirsch was behind. Every single year, every single grade has a set of idioms and sayings that are common to or important to what he defines as standard American English. So what's interesting here is you have these sort of set bases of phrases and figurative language that Americans are supposed to know, and that we would then be able to communicate and convey understanding if we internalized things like eating crow, for instance, in fifth grade. What's interesting, of course, is that you can't help but read this document as itself a cultural construct, right? So if we think about what standard English is, it is a white middle class academic English. And so even here, we can see that a certain culture, and Kusser is going to talk about this idea about language representing power and dominance, etc. Even here, we can see that this list conveys ideas and values that are set and by one particular group and not necessarily those of other groups as well. And that's something many people noted, and I want to show that in 1 second. But I do want to compare that with the idea behind Moll, and I wanted to share the funds of knowledge piece with you last week as a sort of a bridge, right? So this idea of funds of knowledge are these sort of historically accumulated and culturally developed bodies of knowledge and skills essential for household or individual functioning and well-being. So you recall last week this idea about what family knowledge that these Latino students brought to school and whether or not it was recognized in school. This idea that we have these funds of knowledge that are, we might say, situative. They come from certain places, they're from certain cultures, they're located in certain settings, and that we actually possess quite a bit of knowledge, and that whether or not that knowledge is embraced by and leveraged in school is one of the challenges we face as educators. And I think that was something brought up in the group task. And I've, again, as I've been doing in the past, I'm grabbing a random sample of pieces. But I wanted to show these. And I pulled these from comments that people made taking the perspective of Moll on Hirsch, right? And so you can see here there's some issues around whether or not that the curriculum is actually representative of diverse learners and of diverse cultural groups that occupy our schools. Where's the differentiation, right? Where is it the different pathways for students to leverage their own knowledge and or to represent the existing knowledge in new ways? You see diversity here, questions about whether school and home life are different, and that disconnect as well. And I think those are important pieces here, challenges, again, that we're all grappling with. So I thought I'd pull this quote from James Gee, who's quite a famous linguist and one of the sort of the pioneers of sociocultural thinking. It's in the Kusser text, and you can see here as you read this, this is a nice contrast between the cognitive-centered approach and the sociocultural perspective. And right, 1990s really on the cusp here of that. There's some historical background as to why this happened. For those of you who might be old enough to remember that there was quite a debate in the college ranks about how to address multiculturalism, and sociocultural perspectives actually derives from a lot of the conflict that arose in what was then called the culture wars. So I wanted to show this table from the Kusser text. You're going to read chapter 9 this week. And they talk about social identity, and I'm going to use the word social world. And I use social not in that verb sense, like for someone to be social, right? Or to be sociable. But the idea here that social is the idea that we are social beings and that we're constantly engaging in interactions with the external world. Even when we're independent, we're engaging with stimuli, we're in environments, etc. So you can see here things like social identities serve as an orientation or lens for behaving or understanding. Who we are, in other words, kind of defines what we know. And that you can see that we occupy many groups, and that there's differences of ideas between groups, within groups, etc. And that those social identities are fluid. They vary across space and time, and that yeah, we have privilege certain groups over others. So you might think about school as being one social identity and one social world in which certain things are prioritized over another, and that our discourses in school, even you in graduate school, may differ from those when you're the teacher versus you're at home or being out with peers in a non-collegiate setting. So the other week I talked about what the cognitivists were interested in. Let me sort of briefly talk about what socioculturalists are interested in when it comes to education. One is just social activity, right? And I'm thinking about things and ways in which students interact with one another in tasks or even informally, right? They're interested in things like discussion-based instruction. You remember reading that Kukan and Palancar piece from week 4, and that was really the sort of the basis. Their idea of comprehension was really in the social engagement of student to student as well as student to teacher. They're interested in the role of culture. Again, this font of knowledge piece. What are the various cultures that we occupy, including school culture? What are the influence of those on comprehension? And then they're also interested in the interests and experiences of particular student subgroups, right? So we might pull out groups, whether they're ELL versus native speakers, whether we're talking about students who had exposure to this kind of text, etc. We're interested in looking at the particular cultural and social backgrounds of groups of students and how that affects their in-school experiences. We're also interested in the ideas about multiple literacies, right? This idea that we're going to move away from not just even this idea about traditional text, but that we're going to have many experiences and there's many kinds of texts. And that the interaction around the text, around its purposes, its use, the activity, helps define how we engage skills and knowledge. You're also going to see a lot in the Kusser piece around the idea about like what it means to engage in discourse and engage in literacies in school versus out of school. And I'm referring to on the playground, at home, out in the world. And then there's also going to be this focus on what we would call situative knowledge. That is how we understand or know and do things that are very specific tasks or very specific in specific settings. For instance, Kusser is going to talk a bit about the essay, right? That's a task that requires us to do very specific things in very specific settings and for specific purposes. And then it's going to call on different kind of knowledge than we would in other settings. For instance, when we were engaged in sort of casual, informal conversation around the water cooler, etc., about teaching, which is a different kind of situation and thus requires different knowledge and literacies. So, again, we talked a bit about early in the first week about the sociocultural movement in the 90s and early 2000s. And from it, several things came out of it that I think we're still, of course, using today and actually are quite defining for our work. I would say sociocultural has probably had the most significant impact, likely, on what we might call contemporary instruction. And that includes ideas around this focus around student-centered instruction. Reciprocal teaching, which I presume many of you have done, came out of this era, a little bit before really in the cognitive piece, but really took off in the 90s. Socio-emotional learning, which is really hot right now. and this idea about attending to students' social environments and their social behaviors. Differentiation, of course, right? We're thinking a bit about attending to various needs of learners and shifting the environment and tasks and interaction, etc., to meet diverse learners. Culturally responsive pedagogy, CRP, which some of you I hope are familiar with, this idea that we're thinking about the discourses and literacies of particular student groups and cultures, and then responding in kind in our teaching in ways that leverage students' funds of knowledge. And then on the professional development side, the professional learning community comes in the 90s. It's an innovation at that point that comes out of this idea about how knowledge is constructed socially and how teacher knowledge is built through collaboration. So your readings for this week, you're going to read chapter 9 of the Kusser text. There's a section that does the out of school. It's really quite long and really just ends up summarizing about 2 or 3 studies. I want you to skim it. There's a couple ideas to pick up on, but don't feel like you have to do a close read of that particular section. And then inside your group, each group member should pick one of the following texts. You can take a look at them here. They're all around the nature of how social action, social activity affects reading comprehension. So there are 5 texts, which means there's one for every person in your group. If you have 3 people, you need to pick 3 texts. If you have 5 people, every text should be read and one person should read each text. The Glad on Beach piece I see there, I didn't finish it. Glad on Beach is going to say on the response to literature, right? So it's going to really be about how students write to literature and how it's a cultural activity. I want to just talk about the end of the semester because we're getting there. We have really some work left to do around the final essay as well as the final itself. And so you can see here the dates that are coming. You're going to do another lens assignment for next Tuesday. And from there, the draft prep, that date is actually wrong. It's going to be November 21st or November 22nd, and I'll explain that in 1 minute. And then the essay is actually going to be due on Saturday, December 5th. I pushed it back from Tuesday, December 1st. And then you're going to get the take-home final. It's going to be an essay on December 8th, and you'll have 4 days to complete it on your own for due date on Saturday, December 12th. Meanwhile, your assignments for the week, you're going to do the sociocultural lens. It's going to be the same task as the cognitive lens. That means I want you to pick some incident, event in your classroom, and I want you to explore it using what you've learned about the sociocultural perspective from this week. So again, describe your observation, use the readings and some aspect of sociocultural lens. You go back and you might want to use some of the slides to focus it and sort of analyze it and what new understanding you have from utilizing this lens, and then what it means for answering your problem of practice. The group task will be up Tuesday morning, and as well as the problem of practice essay guidelines are now up in the assignments tab. You'll need to actually leave the weekly lessons folder and click on the assignments on the left-hand window side in order to open it. Let me quickly go over the essay guidelines. Really, the task is actually quite simple. You're going to actually write a formal essay answering your problem of practice. I have a couple of requirements, one of which is you're going to need to use at least 4 of your research sources. You, of course, may use more, but at least 4. And I'm also going to want you to include additional data. And so that data may include using the observations that you have conducted and will conduct for the cognitive and socio lens responses. It may include data that you've collected from implementing your problem of practice. I've seen a couple already in the cognitive lens where you've tested 2 different groups, or you ran a pre and post test. So it can be things like that. So if you already started implementing a problem of practice, feel free to include data or findings that you've gotten from it. If you haven't, no worries. You can use your observations. Student work as well. You can bring in written work. And even if you did an oral assessment, you can use that as well. You know, like the research review, I'm offering 2 different formats depending on where you're at and where you're going with this. And so you can see in the guidelines, and you'll need to download the assignment directions. But you can choose between either doing a research review or a journal article. And the research review, again, is going to be if you're still learning about this topic, and if you're doing a journal article, you're actually experimenting already in your classroom, and you're going to sort of report on your findings in a way like the readings we've done. Give me a holler if you have any questions.